Welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast where we have discussions on public policy and current events. We keep things civil and respectful, and we try to understand perspectives we disagree with. Hopefully that's enriching for the audience, and it certainly will be for all of us here today participating in the discussion. My name is Sam Taylor. I'm the host for today, and I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer at our National Conversation, the nonprofit associated with this podcast. I'm joined today by a number of ONC writers, and we're going to be talking about Trump's first full month in office, just reflecting on the various policy issues, his performance, and we're really going to try to be diving into perspectives we disagree with on this subject, try to understand one another's views, as opposed to just giving a single narrative. Here's what this first month has been like under the Trump administration. So let's just kind of go through sequentially here, kind of in alphabetical order. I'm going to start with Alexis, if that's all right. So Alexis, would you be able to give kind of just a little intro to yourself, and then I'll ask some questions about your piece.
Hi everyone, my name is Alexis Barrage, and I'm a policy writer here at ONC. I've been here for about 2 semesters now, and I'm excited to talk with you guys all today.
Awesome. We're excited to have you, Alexis. Thank you for coming on. Now, and looking over kind of what you've written on the Trump administration, you have this very interesting point that I want to dig into a little more. You talk about how, in your view, by both progressive and conservative metrics, the administration, has been failing this first month. So I'm curious as to kind of what you mean by that, and if you can dig into what those metrics are, and what you think it represents for the future of the administration.
Yeah, so honestly, I'd like to start out with the day one comment that he mentioned while he was campaigning. He mentioned that he would lower inflation, but it seems to actually be rising, as like a current topic is the egg prices right now. But to address your question, in terms of progressive policy, I know that a lot of progressives feel like we're walking back right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sorry, did you have more to say on the subject and on the conservative metrics?
In terms of conservative, I know that right now we acknowledge that we don't have the current infrastructure and natural resources necessary for manufacturing. And so in terms of the tariffs that we're doing right now, it's acknowledged that it's a little, what is the word? Ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm.
We still need to work on some of the implementation before we enact these tariffs, I would say.
Mm. Working on bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., we need to do more before implementing, something like that actually does that. And so where we're kind of jumping the gun with these policies. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, got it. So I guess my question would be, obviously there's a lot of conservatives who say that, no, the Trump administration is doing a lot of fantastic work, especially in promoting government efficiency, cutting spending, things like that. Would you say that there's any metric that you think is valuable that the Trump administration is succeeding on right now? Or would you say there's in your view, not much good to say?
I come from a progressive view, so I would say that, in my opinion, the metrics that I'm looking at, and I specifically mentioned like the DEI, the LGBTQ rights, and then immigration, I would say no. But again, with conservative metrics, I guess that's a little bit more tricky, because again, defining what benchmarks that they're trying to make has already been abstract. In my opinion, it's been unclear.
Mm. Yeah, and there's been some confusion as to kind of how much is actually going to be cut through Doge, etc., different things like that. So we'll get more into those subjects, but thank you for starting us off there, Alexis. Let's go now to Maelyn, um, and that's how you pronounce your name, correct?
Yeah, Maelyn.
Awesome. So, you wrote a piece that talks mainly about Doge, which so I think it's a good segue from kind of where we ended off with Alexis there, um, and talking about miscalculations that have been made in, say, how much Doge has been saving, etc. I mean, there's a little while back they noted $65 million or something like that. I just recently checked, and it looks like, according to their latest updates, they've saved U.S. taxpayers, what was it precisely? $54.63 billion. That's as of recording this, which is February 28th. So there's been some confusion around that, some confusion around the implementation of, federal layoffs, etc. Could you dig into a little more the sorts of confusions or miscalculations you're seeing, the sources you're drawing from, and how that's informing your perspective?
Yes, so I got those numbers from just a few investigative journalism articles, one being on Forbes and then the other being the New York Times. There were a couple of incidents within those articles that they were drawing from, but the most notable one was that $655 million pay cut. I believe that was coming from the border and border control and I can't quite exactly remember it right now. I need to get my laptop out, but it was that number being recorded 3 times, and I think that has a lot to do with just the promises of government efficiency that have been made under the Doge kind of creation of that sector of government. I think it's a lot of pressure as a new department to save money and save money very quickly and prove that they're working, but and I have no doubt that money is being saved, especially as so many cuts are being implemented. But at the same time, you can't have slip ups like that because it draws a lot of trust from the public for this new kind of department. Um, Another thing I brought up in my expose was dividend checks. Elon has talked a lot about dividend checks, and people, whether those dividend checks are realistic or not, are relying on them and are hoping for them. And when you have slip ups that are $6,500 million worth, that can drastically change the size of these promised dividend checks. And so I think it's very important to like get those calculations correct, especially the people that are on that job.
Hmm. Do you feel like these errors are just a result of how quickly Doge is engaging in this activity? And would you be supportive of something like Doge if it, happened over a longer timetable? Or do you take issue with some deeper underlying aspect of this department?
So I actually don't completely disagree with promoting government efficiency. I think that can be a very good thing, and that we do have a sense of government waste. There's always going to be waste in these sort of things, but sometimes government sectors do jobs that aren't as obvious for the US in bettering society as a whole. Like, for instance, while I was researching, I came across some points where the so basically there was a round of firings for the government, a lot of first year hires for national parks and above, and jobs similar to that were cut and let go. And that really sparked a lot of backlash, especially as natural parks are huge for tourism in the United States, and they bring in, I believe, 85 billion something a year in revenue in total. And so you take that away, you make them more dangerous, you let paths be overgrown, which leads people to being lost even more. People are eventually going to stop utilizing these great tourism spots that we have within the US. That hurts an entire industry, which hurts everything. So I saw that they were kind of taking back what they had done, they started hiring more seasonal positions for park rangers and such. And so I think that it's good that they're able to adjust in those circumstances. I think that Doge has done a lot, and it's done a lot quickly, which is always going to bring problems when you don't take the necessary time to evaluate kind of what each move should be, and you're trying to get rid of government waste, so you're focusing on firing anyone who doesn't want to be in their position at that time, or anyone who hasn't been in their position for long. I think that there's a good way to increase government efficiency, but blanket firings and mass emails being sent out and you have to respond to this is just trying to do it quickly, which kind of brings me back to my point of fudging the numbers or miscalculating a little bit. Like they want to show that what they're doing is working so badly, but if you put your foot on the gas a little bit too much, you're going to lose a lot of the public's trust, if that makes sense.
Got it. Now we have two more writers that I want to get to before we kind of engage in open discussion here. Let's start with Nirati, who is one of our policy content writers at ONC. Now, you wrote a pretty, I suppose, scathing critique of the Trump administration's first term. So just kind of reacting to what's been said here about Doge, maybe other elements of this. And sorry, I didn't mean first term. I meant first month of the second term. Just kind of what's your reaction to everything that's going on, and do you think how these issues have been covered so far? Issues of Doge's speed, or maybe not having a thorough manufacturing infrastructure with which to implement tariffs kind of covers a lot of the issues with the administration, or do you think there's something more, deep or fundamental that you really want to draw attention to?
No, yeah, I really agree with what Maelyn and Alexis said. Specifically, at the end, Maelyn was talking about how there's just so much that's been done so quickly. And yeah, in my piece, I talked about pausing federal grants and loans before they went through and reviewed if they aligned with the Trump administration's goals. And I feel like there was a much better way to work around that. And I think just because so much is happening, they're firing um, several NOAA employees. There's really no backup plan, and there's been hardly any time, less than 40 days, that they've had to actually figure out how they can move forward. And I think in my issue and in my piece, what I talked about a lot is that he's been watching Biden do so much for 4 years. And I think that kind of created a sense of revenge that he wanted to take. And he was kind of brooding for 4 years, seeing all of this happen. And I think now the Trump administration kind of seems a little power hungry. And they want to implement a lot of the things that they've been talking about. But I think because they've been held back for 4 years, it's just happening too fast for anyone to keep up with it. And for any organization, any nonprofit, any government institution to handle it, and their employees to keep up.
Yeah, so just a few things I want to dig into there a little more. As I understand it, maybe you disagree with a number of the policies and that the Trump administration is implementing, but it sounds like you're echoing what's been said before that obviously Trump made promises to his constituents, his base, people who voted for him, and he was elected, and so he's adhering to those promises, but maybe the issue is, even for those who would agree with that, it's just the speed of the implementation that's the issue here. Is there anything that you'd like to maybe talk about or focus on that's I don't know, like, even if it was implemented in a way that wasn't speedy, that was very cautious or prudent, that you would still find especially objectionable, or do you still think it's no, the speed is the biggest issue here?
I do think the speed is the biggest issue, but with things like pausing federal grants and loans, really they're just limiting the ones that don't align with their administration's goals, which, yes, it's fair. I mean, they were elected, and so they're going to implement what they decide to implement. But I think it's um, so many of their DEI policies are being gotten rid of because they're quote unquote divisive, and they don't unite. They prevent the country from uniting. But I think a lot of the policies that they're trying to eliminate, a lot of, especially the money that's given to support environmental causes, I feel like a lot of those are simply just being overlooked. Yes, because they don't align with the administration's goals, but at the same time, there's so many people, almost half the country, that believes that these that money should be given to these initiatives. So I think just the fact that we're so quick to eliminate them, but also so many of them are being eliminated, is in fact more divisive than than they want to admit, and it kind of goes against what they were trying to eliminate through the elimination of the DEI policies.
Got it. So we often talk about, okay, Trump made these promises, he was put into office, and so now he's fulfilling them. But you're kind of making this point that, well, there's his constituency is now composed of the entirety of America, and having a more thorough discussion based process in actually figuring out what these policies look like would probably be warranted to serve the American people effectively. Is that the point you're making?
Yeah, I just think when when you're campaigning, you're going to appeal to who you want to appeal to. You're going to make a lot of these promises, but at the end of the day, when you're elected, you're president of the entire population of America, not half who agrees with you. And I think what I was talking about earlier is that because he wasn't president for 4 years, I think he's kind of lost sight that he's leading the whole population.
Yeah, I have something to add to that too. I like how you kind of talked about he feels it feels as though he's a bit power hungry right now in this situation. And I just want to point out that that hasn't proved to be necessarily bad in all aspects of his presidency so far, particularly with foreign relations and the multiple conflicts that we've had going on. With Biden in office, everything was just kind of Biden was allowing a lot of continuance of things, and he didn't have a very strong fist to put down. And now Trump is leveraging the U.S. relations to these nations heavily. And I do think that there are some controversies that can come about of those, but at the end of the day, he's forwarding these talks and negotiations, and that is kind of a show of power and just having a really strong hand in that situation that I think the U.S. was lacking, which is a benefit of his term so far.
Yeah, I do really agree that one thing I think he's been doing well is asserting power, and I think doing things like taking action in general. He promised to really be harsh on immigration, and he's done that. And I think it's not really what a lot of people want, but I think, yeah, it's a contrast to what the last 4 years have been like. And even in the way his conversation with Zelensky the other day went, I think he seemed extremely harsh, and like he was taking advantage of how kind of lenient the US has been on that.
Yeah,
All
I
very good
agree.
points. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Maelyn.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and specifically, in Israel, he's being very deceitful in the statements he's making regarding Gaza and how things are going to be handled down there. But I do think that he has the intention of kind of forcing and manipulating other nations to step up, take in refugees. He's got relations with Saudi Arabia in the mix there. A lot of people, because he's such a strong show of force, are afraid to speak out against even the crazy things he's saying about Gaza taking over, making it the Riviera of the Middle East. And it's kind of like seeing the silver linings in those crazy situations like that, more specifically. And then also, for the first time ever, like, we're engaging in talks with Russia before Ukraine. And I think it's alarming, but it is, again, just a show of that, like, force that's kind of making people friendlier to the U.S. might not be a good word, but more accommodating of the U.S.'s wants in these situations.
Certainly a very transactional approach to foreign policy. We'll maybe get into that subject a little more thoroughly. I I'm sympathetic with a lot of what you all have been saying, but I do think there's some points here that might kind of disrupt this consensus that's kind of emerging between us, and that we can really dig into. But before I offer some thoughts there, I want to turn to Connor. Connor, you've been kind of silent for this little bit, so let's give you the chance to kind of offer your reaction to what's been said. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you would generally identify yourself as a conservative. So, as someone who has that approach, how do you perceive the Trump administration's first month in office, and what's your reaction to the statements that have been made on, the speediness of Doge and the problems that accompany that, the tariffs and not being prepared to deal with the ramifications, and then obviously this very transactional and harsh foreign policy and its effects. I know there's a lot there, but I kind of want you to just kind of, I don't know, react to what's been said.
Yeah. Well, first of all, hi everyone. My name's Connor. I'm the director of the policy content department here. I am a self-described conservative, but I love civil debate, civil dialogue, and discussing these sorts of issues with people from all sorts of different places on the political spectrum. So, yeah, I mean, to keep it short and frank, I think it's been fantastic. I've been really ecstatic with a lot of the stuff I've seen so far. I understand where a lot of progressives are coming from. If we're talking about stuff like LGBTQ rights, that's kind of can be a little bit of a rabbit hole. It depends how do you want to define rights, etc. I think that there are a lot of places in the world where these sorts of people don't have rights. Where you go to Gaza and you get stoned for being homosexual. That's not something we do here in the U.S. And I've seen a lot of people on the left. They're genuinely. I feel like they have this fear that's so misplaced or overblown. People are talking about concentration camps as a legitimate possibility. They foresee that in America's future under Trump, that Donald Trump could round up homosexuals and adjacent groups and throw them into concentration camps. And obviously that's not going to happen. But I think when it comes to social issues and such, I think the American public, obviously just the way that they voted, not all Americans, but the majority of this country voted to kind of roll things back to a more socially moderate and reserved a status quo, which has really been our historical status quo here in America up until the last 10 years, when we had this, starting in roughly the mid 2010s to the late 2010s, when we had this sort of radical kind of, I like to call it a Jacobin style, very ultra left-wing revolution to take over, maybe not take over, but utilize government institutions and such to affect change with a very clear political agenda, and including a lot of that is including very, very, very liberal social agendas, right? So I think that the American people kind of want to see things dialed back to a happy medium where they used to be. And I don't think it means that, we're going to take anybody's rights away or throw them in a prison camp or, prevent them from living or marrying whoever they want to marry and so forth. But when it comes to Doge and, this Department of Government Efficiency, I think that Maelyn and, Nirati, you guys talked about this. Yeah, it's happening quick. We only have 4 years to do this, and I think inevitably there are going to be some mistakes along the way. And a lot of people don't like Elon Musk, or at least a lot of folks on the left. But I'll say this: the guy is kind of crazy. I think he's a little bit, if you want to call it special. I think he might be like really, really high functioning, autistic or something along those lines. But I do trust him with this kind of thing. If you look at the way he runs his companies, if you look at Tesla, the Boring Company, SpaceX, I mean, the guy is just a genius. And not only that, but um, he's incredibly efficient with the way he runs things. He's a workhorse, and he prides himself on that, on getting things done quick, and creating a culture like this, very like deep running, pervasive culture of accountability and integrity in the way that you carry out operations, and just integrity in yourself and your work that you do for the company, whether you work for the government or you work for Tesla or whatever it is. It's about getting things done. And he recently admitted in a tweet, he said, look, I'll admit to you right now, there are going to be some mistakes. So please forgive us in advance. But just know that we're working overtime, just like, my employees and I work 16 hours a day at Tesla. You can bet that, while you guys are getting to bed early, we're going to be up late, working real hard to get these mistakes ironed out. And I do trust them. And yeah, I guess foreign policy, I know you guys touched on that. I think it's really just a breath of fresh air. Look, I think lackadaisical and supine leadership is okay during peacetime. Um, when your country is going through an era of prosperity, let's say the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when the post World War II era, when America was prospering, and wages were high relative to the cost of living, and people were more decadent and comfortable. I think it doesn't really matter as much, who's in office, whether they're kind of awkward or not so great at statesmanship with adversaries or allies alike. But when it comes to the world that we live in right now, it's a very turbulent world. We have a lot of social turbulence, economic turbulence, etc. It's really, to me, I've been very alarmed over the last year or two at how much turbulence, how much violence, and how much war is going on right now. It feels like a chess game, and all of the pieces are moving into very, very alarming positions. I'm not sure. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how it's going to play out in the coming years, but it is alarming. And to me, it signals a very clear need for a strong man. Not necessarily a dictator. We live in a democracy here in America, right? But we do need somebody who can bring the hammer down. And sure, it might not be, Trump is certainly not statesman-like most of the time, as you guys have seen with I just watched a couple minutes of his conversation with Zelensky, and it was wild, to say the least. So a lot of this stuff is alarming to people who are, especially older politicians who are used to the status quo and kind of just beating around the bush and maybe not necessarily get anything done, but we're not stomping on anybody's toes either, which seems to be the most important thing in politics now. But at least he's letting him, letting people know, if you're an ally of ours, and whatever it is, you're meeting your 2% spending goals in NATO, or this or that, or you're keeping drugs out of the border. If you're Mexico, then great. But if you're failing to hit on these very important criteria that are of great interest to the domestic internal security of the United States, and the well-being of American citizens, then we're going to have a problem. And we really don't have time to play around right now, because it feels like there's just so many powder kegs going on, just resting at various points across the globe, and really any one of them could go off any day now, and then a larger global conflict could start or something like that, God forbid. So we really need somebody who can come in and just say, hey, you're not performing up to par, or you claim that we're allies, and yet we're fronting the majority of the costs for your national security. You're saddling American taxpayers with the burden of securing your nation. So these are all things that are in the interests of American citizens. And I understand that the delivery is rough a lot of the time, but I think uh, it's necessary.
Thank you, Connor. No, there's a lot to get into there. So thank you for sharing that perspective. Instead of maybe sectioning this off and like as the host saying, okay, we're going to talk about this now, this element of the issue, etc. I just kind of want to open this up to conversation. Nirati, Alexis, Maelyn, if there's anything that you want to kind of grapple with, anything you want to note about what Connor said, maybe anything that you thought was useful or kind of enriching for your own perspective, and anything that you dispute. We'll just kind of open it up and see where the conversation takes us.
Yeah, I honestly I really like how you put a lot of your points. I think that it's very understandable to see where you're coming from. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is, so you talk about, obviously there are people who are, their views are a little bit more extreme and they're saying that they're worried about concentration camps and such. But what do you think of the Pentagon's recent statement about how they're going to bar transgender people from engaging in the military, in the U.S. military? And do you think that that qualifies as a valid worry for these groups of people who you kind of said before were thinking extremely in that circumstance?
Yeah, see, this is where you're getting into, what are we defining as rights? You know, I think that I'll start by saying this, I guess I am very more libertarian in this way because people say, "Oh, well, you're anti-gay," or you're against human rights because to be frank and upfront, I personally, I don't agree with LGBTQ culture. I don't agree with it. It doesn't mean that I don't, I want to, I don't want to prevent you if you're a homosexual or such. I don't want to prevent you from living your life freely as you see fit. I don't want to do that. But, people say, well, we live in a free country, so that means I can do anything I want. That's not true. There are always limits on freedom, right? You can't run naked through the streets of New York. So uh, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that yes, I want to live in a country where obviously where we don't stone homosexuals or cast them away into exile into some foreign country somewhere. But at the same time, how are we defining rights here? Do I think a lot of Americans are concerned about um, the LGBTQ's propensity to, and I guess it's not just them. I think really we're talking about media, the American media landscape, whether it's entertainment, Hollywood, television, cinema, popular culture, of kind of pushing this stuff into the forefront of public consciousness, like really shoving it down people's throats. When I remember when I was a kid, my parents had my dad, one of his closest friends was a homosexual woman, and we used to have dinner with her and her partner all the time, and they were the nicest people. They're my parents' age, so they're baby boomers. But you would have never known that they were gay if you were just talking to them on the streets. It wasn't there. They you never see them at parades like wearing strap-ons or a thong and trying to talk to children and stuff like that. And I think that's where a lot of the concern is coming from, that people are saying, hey, this isn't. It's one thing, if you want to go home, if you're a man and you want to go home with another man at the end of the night, that's totally fine. I don't want to prevent you from doing that. But when we're talking about transgender stuff, I that's where I think you have to draw a line at rights. Like I don't think when it comes to foreign policy and the military, the military is a well-oiled killing machine. That's what we're talking about here. Let's make no mistake about it, okay? The military, it's in the business of war, of killing people at the end of the day, for better or for worse. That's what the military does. And I don't think that transgender people are in the best mental state. I think when you're on this cocktail of different hormones and when you're kind of oscillating between various identities, I think you're just a lot less stable. And furthermore, I think when we're talking about aggression, which is what the military is all about, I think we need like real men, like old fashioned, like sure, people might say toxic masculinity. That's a popular word. Let's call it that. I think that's what you need is these big, I don't even know if I could do it, like we need these old fashioned men to go out there and, digging trenches, sleeping in the dirt, living off of when you're in the military, you live off of food rations for, you're eating little like dried meat cubes out of a bag, and you still got to be able to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and ruck 12 miles and then engage in hand-to-hand combat, because that's what it's about. And I think that there's no place for these sorts of people who might be oscillating or just kind of have this fractured identity where they're just not too stable or sure of themselves or who they are. And that's the sort of stuff that you let that into the military and it's going to crumble. Well, our military we have a first-class military for a reason, because our standards are high and we do discriminate. And that's exactly how it should be, not in a way that is unfair, but in a way that suggests that we're coming at this from a place of we're concerned about our national security and the well-being of American operations abroad.
Thank you for that response. I actually have to go. Sorry, I talked about this with you earlier, so I'm going to leave. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to seeing how the rest of this conversation pans out.
Thank you, Maelyn, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Maelyn. I just want to respond to what Connor said just now and also before. I think you had some really great points. I think you communicated them really well. And I'll start with what you said about the military. Our military has a rigorous process to join. It's not really like anyone can just join if they want to, and a lot of that is physical and it is a mental thing too. But do you think that if say a transgender person wants to join the military, they pass everything, they do it in a fair legal way, do you think then if our country allows them to join the military, then that's a problem? Or I just want to understand why if they pass everything required, then it would be an issue. Because from my perspective, that's saying our country approves. Our country says that this specific person can join the military.
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is where we might just come down to disagreements. If somebody like that, to me, gets in the military, then it just means that the criteria are need to be raised, or they're poorly set up. So it's nothing personal. I don't hold any personal animosity towards these people at all, but I just think that you can't, when it comes to stuff like that, like the military, or this just dives into DEI as a whole. I was talking with a friend about this, and it's whatever, if it's I work at a restaurant. If you wanna lower the standards or the barriers to entry, or like at colleges and universities, they're getting rid of test scores and standardized test scores, graduate entrance exams and such, so they can lower the barrier of entry, and so they can hit diversity quotas. That's okay. That's the negative effect, the net negative effect that you're gonna get from that isn't as nearly as consequential. It just means that, okay, well, whatever. If it's a restaurant, then if you're abolishing meritocratic standards, then okay, the quality of service might go down a little bit because the people you're hiring aren't quite as robust or fit for the job. as previous hires, but whatever. It's like it's somebody's food. It's like at the end of the day, the service wasn't as good, fine. But when it comes to stuff like the military or let's say like air traffic control or these like very highly critical um, industries or institutions, we're talking about people's lives are on the line. So there are certain things that I just think need to remain purely meritocratic and whatever. If it's like if air traffic 99% of air traffic controllers are white, figure out why people of color, more Indians or more African Americans or more Middle Easterners or Asians aren't getting into air traffic control. I think a lot of this also has to do with more like social issues and so the individual social fabrics, cultural fabrics within each I guess disparate racial kind of conglomerate. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a topic for a different day. But yeah, I think that the certain things should remain meritocratic, and if people like this are allowed into the military, I just don't think it should be allowed. That means the standards are too low. And I'm not doing this I'm not saying this from a discriminatory place, but it's because I'm concerned about maintaining the the prestige of these institutions that are responsible for lives.
So
Okay.
I do have a few thoughts on this, and I will say, Connor, thank you again for sharing your perspective. I will just be completely transparent. I really value everything that you've shared, but I will say personally, I do disagree with probably about 75% of it. So I'd love to get into that a little more and kind of, talk about how I can better understand your perspective, what you're saying, what you're not saying, and maybe offer an alternative view as well. But I also don't want to dominate the conversation, as the host. So before I offer my thoughts, Alexis or Nirati, is there anything else you want to note about Connor's perspective, what you're thinking about, anything else you want to talk about here? I want to make sure that the writers kind of take center stage here.
I think I'm good for now. I appreciate your perspective, Connor. Thank you.
Um, I just want to say one more thing about the point you made earlier, before all the military stuff. Um, is that okay, Sam, or should we
Yeah,
move on?
absolutely. Go ahead.
Um, this was like when we were talking about like Trump getting things done, and yeah, I think you brought up a really good point that they have warned us. They have said like mistakes are going to be made, and I think to Maelyn's earlier point, like they're getting things done fast, which is what hasn't been done before. I think a lot of where mine and I think I can say that a lot of other people are frustrated with the fact that the way they go about it, the things the administration says, it kind of it seems like they're gloating about like the amount of power that they have, and that kind of like no one really wants a president that's gonna go and like be the face of an administration that like posts ASMR of deportation videos, and kind of just that kind of ridicules the people's lives who they're interrupting. And yes, that is their policy, but I just think like things like making a video or making such harsh statements, it kind of it's a little misleading. Like, yes, his policies say one thing, but when people are making statements like these and making videos like them, you don't know like what they're going to do. And I know you're talking about how people have like these irrational fears of concentration camps and stuff. And yes, they are like irrational, but I think there are a lot of other more toned down things that he can do, especially with at the rate he's doing other things. I think there are many more from, I think, social issues that he could create that would divide our country based off of what he's saying and the rate at which he is enacting other changes.
I'd like to summarize what Nirati said because I think your point is that presentation is important when you're trying to project unity instead of division. So I think that is important to note.
Yeah, that's certainly that's a good point. No, that's a fair question. Certainly, I'll admit that like I said earlier, Trump is not statesmanlike. He doesn't he doesn't have time for the niceties or or anything like that really. And yeah, stuff like the ASMR of illegal aliens being sent back to their countries of origins, etc. It is sure it's definitely comes off as rude or insensitive to a lot of people, but I think a lot of people are looking at this stuff. Trump supporters, conservatives are saying, okay, yeah, it's probably gonna. I think they like the fact that it's like, oh, it's upsetting the liberals. I think really what you're seeing here, all this is like purpose, very purpose driven insensitivity. It's Victor Davis Hanson, who's a senior lecturer at Hillsdale College, was talking about this the other day. I was listening to him. It's part of a counter revolution. To the left's original revolution over the last decade. And, the left is very, their top priority is political correctness and, kind of this sort of beat around the bush language, include, constantly being aware of, inclusive language, all of these things, all of these terms. And I think a lot of conservatives see that as very exhausting. And so I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not crude, because it is. But on the other hand, I think this is just kind of the natural blowback that I was, I think it's something that I was expecting to see. I didn't know how it was going to manifest exactly. And sometimes I wake up and I look at, some of this stuff and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really gonna, rub some people the wrong way. But, I think it's just a kind of an extreme reaction to, a lot of extreme social and cultural measures that have been set over the last 10 years. So, but yes, it is crude and insensitive oftentimes.
So maybe to take us back just a little bit, we're kind of jumping around in the conversation, but that's absolutely fine. There's a lot to get into here. I really want to try to understand your perspective more, Connor, because as I said, especially when we start talking about, maybe how we treat certain demographics with respect to professional positions in the government, whether that's the military or elsewhere, I find myself having a hard time, kind of understanding that perspective thoroughly that you're offering here. And I'll tell you why. I agree that especially with these positions, we need to be very meritocratic. We need to ensure that public safety is prioritized. I don't think that, really anyone or any very large group of people disputes that, at least in an explicit or knowing way. However, I worry that when we're talking about demographics like the genderqueer community, or other demographics, this happens a lot with I'd imagine various racial or ethnic groups, etc. A lot of things that are targeted in DEI initiatives, that we make assumptions about these groups of people that inform how well, in our understanding, they are fit for a position, and we let that inform our policies on whether they should be offered positions or not, and we unduly enforce discrimination where it wouldn't be appropriate per se. Now, with the genderqueer community, it is true that there is a high level of, depression or mental illness or suicidality. Now, we can get into debates over the causes of that. A lot of conservatives point out that, in their view, rates are too high to be explained by societal, discrimination or oppression. But, even so, I would expect that might have some role. We can get into that a little bit if we want. But in any case, we talk about associations between being transgender or genderqueer and these, various mental illnesses, which we take to be an impediment to professional performance. But, really what we should be doing is we should be analyzing those particular illnesses which we know will directly impede professional performance, right? So depression, your maybe your ability to cope with administering, as you said, the literal violence that is required for being a part of the military. And I think that we can analyze those things separately. And if it just so happens that a lot of members of the genderqueer community are prevented from entering the military on the basis of those, completely meritocratic or objective factors, then very well. But I think that we enter into dangerous territory when we start to assume that because they are genderqueer and because there is this general relationship with these other, mental illnesses, that we're just going to add being genderqueer, being transgender to one of those things that will prevent you from military service, and treat that like it is one of these criteria on which to judge whether someone is prepared for service, as opposed to something that is in some statistical way related to those other criteria. Does what I'm saying make sense? Like, I worry that we're assuming that being genderqueer is itself an impediment to professional performance when it's only statistically related to some of these impediments, and there's no reason to target genderqueer people directly if we have effective systems for vetting people based on how well they'll perform in the military. And I just worry that if we shift away from that perspective and the focus on those objectively meritocratic criteria, that we start to engage in undue discrimination. We start to let our policy be informed by stereotypes that might not be supported by the medical or psychological evidence. We start to jump the gun and let ideology enter into a place where this objective assessment of someone's abilities should take precedence. So that's the perspective I have, and that's my worry. And that's where I think we can be engaging in the sort of prejudice discrimination. And that's something that I worry about, especially given my interactions with the LGBTQ plus community. I have a lot of people who are very dear to me in that community, and though I'm not a member myself, it is something that concerns a lot of people very personally. And though we might not be able to say they're going to be put in concentration camps, I do think that there is some valid worry about undue discrimination. So I want to offer you the chance to respond to that, Connor. And is there something there that you disagree with? Is there something that I'm missing?
No, I don't think so. I'm willing to make that. I'm willing to draw that distinction. Absolutely. You're right. Just like I wouldn't want, leftist ideology creeping into institutions. Folks on the left wouldn't want right-wing ideology creeping into institutions. Ideally, we keep the level of bias at a minimum. But yeah, sure. I mean, if you wanna have that conversation, then I'm more than willing to separate, people from the LGBT community. It's not so much like traditional, like, let's say, like lesbian or gay, like homosexuals that worries me. It's it's just it's like the transgender faction. Just from what I've seen, I feel like they seem, just from like a personal perspective, I'm just kind of, I don't really have any like statistics to back this up, but this is just from like personal public interactions, like being out in the last few years. They seem less stable than a lot of lesbians or gay men that I've met in the past. My doctor is a gay man, and he's awesome. I love the guy. Dr. Toe Cracks, if you're watching this, I love you. You're awesome. But a lot of these people, you know, like my doctor, it's like you wouldn't know he was gay. And I think this maybe just has to do with the fact that they come from like an older generation where it's not, they didn't really get into the nitty gritty, like hardcore identity politics of the newly emerged LGBTQ ideology, which I really think you can draw like a fair distinction between like normal homosexuality, which I'm totally for. I don't have a problem with that, and this new brand of radical ideology. But yeah, I'd be happy to evaluate people for service in the military or other critical industries or sectors like air traffic control or pilots, based off those standards. I wouldn't. I think if I was admitting somebody to those programs, I wouldn't look at them. I wouldn't look at their application and say, oh, well, you're transgender, then you're likely to be mentally ill or whatever it is, or unfit for service. I'm always willing to give somebody the benefit of the doubt. I guess the reason why I said that was because, you said there are higher rates of correlation with whatever it is, like elevated anxiety levels, or, possible like bipolar disorders, or personality disorders, or these sorts of things. That's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about somebody, you know, who I'm not concerned about, that a man likes to dress as a woman or vice versa or anything in between. I'm just concerned about, somebody being, in a position where they're overseas, commanding a platoon of American soldiers, boots on the ground, or commanding operations in Iraq or Syria. And, they have a history of struggling with like some sort of personality disorder. But I would never discriminate against them just because they're non-binary, or whatever they feel that they are. So yeah, I think that is an important line to draw. That it's my concern. It rests with letting folks into these institutions who suffer from medical disorders. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who are in the LGBT community, and I know some of them. I know some of them, and they seem just fine to me. I have daily interactions with them. And then there are a lot of others that really, it just seems to be like a running theme that's concerning to me.
Thank you for clarifying that, Connor. And if I could just offer one more thought here, I think that it's useful to have these sorts of conversations, because when you had initially offered your thoughts, the way I had interpreted it, and the way that I think a lot of my friends would have interpreted it as, oh, I don't want just trans people and genderqueer people in general in the military, and that's it. I don't want you there because you are trans or because you are genderqueer. But when we've been able to dig into your position a little more, I think something that's lost in the rhetoric is, really we all want people in these positions who can work effectively, and where we don't need to make assumptions necessarily about, okay, well, you're trans, that automatically disqualifies you. We can judge it on the basis of these underlying criteria. And I think that's a policy that most everyone can get behind, and that doesn't implicate this undue and kind of automatic prejudice and discrimination that a lot of the people I'm close to worry daily about, and are I think rightly so very afraid of. And I think that those sorts of nuances are just lost in most of our partisan rhetoric, where we don't get past that initial point. And in a normal sphere, I wouldn't have really understood what you were saying, and I would have been left just thinking, gosh, Connor and I are just in completely different worlds. I don't know. Are there any other thoughts? It can be on this topic, or just the Trump administration, its policies and performance more broadly. We can jump around more. We'll have to wrap up soon, as we've been in the room and discussing for a fair bit, but I want to make sure that we can dig into these topics.
Alexis, did you want to say anything? I don't want to talk over you. I didn't know if she was trying to talk.
You're currently muted, Alexis.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, I'll just say it was a really great discussion, honestly. We don't really have too many like this. And I just, Connor, you keep mentioning like air traffic control. Like, I know maybe I'm nitpicking, but you frequently use that like in kind of same phrases, sentences as like DEI policies and stuff like that. And is that like because of Trump's implication that it's because of that, like the recent crash on the 29th of January was because of DEI policies, or like because I think my concern with that is that like if we start to imply that including people of different backgrounds, and yes, I know there are some issues with that, like maybe they're not qualified, but I think if we just start to say like, yeah, like DEI policies cause these crashes, then like it's going to lead to inevitable like discrimination.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't want to, honestly, I don't I don't know. I'm not a researcher on air traffic control and the correlation between DEI initiatives and plane crashes. But so I can't pin that on DEI, and I don't think we should until, reports and the numbers have been run, which could take some time. So let's kind of leave that ambiguous for now. But no, I'm more than happy to see, whatever it is, Asians or Middle Easterners or whatever ethnic minority, doing, these sorts of jobs like air traffic controller, pilots, these highly illustrious jobs. But I want to make sure that they got there because they beat out every single other applicant to that job and basically like an open combat, like in the free market, right, of ideas and test scores in this case. So I even if something that my best friend and I were talking, let's say an ethnic minority is given a job as a pilot. That's great. I would never discriminate against them just because of the fact that they're an ethnic minority, but it's really, really important that they got that job as a pilot because they beat out every single other person, higher pilot scores, higher flight log scores, everything. And that they weren't given any sort of handicap or that the barrier to entry wasn't lowered for them. Because again, you're dealing with people's lives. So I think that's super, super important. Like, even if their scores are good, like good, they scored good, but not great, that's a huge problem if you're letting just people in, like color, let's be colorblind for a second, whether they're black, brown, blue, or green. That's a huge problem if you're saying, well, now for air traffic controllers, we're just lowering the standards a little bit. Your test scores have to be good, but they no longer have to be absolutely outstanding. That's a major problem because these are just the sorts of jobs where there's actually zero margin for error. And if you scored, if you're an ethnic minority and you scored a 96 on your exam and you were given the position over other people because they lowered the barrier to entry for you, and they say, oh, you no longer have to score above 100% to get this job. I'm not saying that these people aren't smart people because they absolutely are, but they need to be, these standards need to be held to the highest degree possible. But yeah, I think you make a good point. Just we don't want to pin this on DEI because you're right. It has that's a whole nother rabbit box with negative implications.
Yeah, I really agree with all of what you said. I think if we make things merit based, that's how people get where they need to be and deserve to be.
And I wanted to bring up something that Sam had said earlier. He said something about clarity getting lost in definitions. So I had a question, Connor, because I think my issue with rhetoric surrounding DEI right now is that there's affirmative action and then there's DEI. And I wanted to know if you thought there was a difference between the two.
No, I kind of see them as like one and the same. I mean, Sam, affirmative action is essentially just action at the federal level, like federal mandates, right? To essentially platform minority communities, whether it's the gay community or the African American community or the American Middle Eastern community or such, and give them a springboard to achieve equity and parity with the rest of the population. Is that right?
Correct. And then with DEI, the way that I view it as a progressive is it's typically post hiring. I know a lot of people think of it as like hiring quotas or standardize, like lowering the standardized testing, but it actually has a lot more to do with like cultural observances and ensuring that minorities and like other groups have spaces where they feel safe. So if it were framed like that, how do you think you would feel about it?
What
Like,
do you
how much
mean
would that
by,
necessarily?
so you're saying it has less to do with reorganizing admissions criteria and more to do with cultural observances and creating safe spaces for minorities. Is that right?
Correct.
So I don't quite understand that. Like, what does that entail though from from a corporation's point of view? How are you? I mean, you're still changing the selection criteria, right?
No, it wouldn't change the selections criteria. It's actually post hiring. So it's the permissions offered afterwards. So, for example, let's say you have some sort of physical handicap. It's like offering braille or like vocal
Like
permissions, if that makes
accommodations.
sense, or accommodations. Thank you.
Yeah, I still I just to me I don't think that makes sense because DEI is about it's about platforming ethnic minorities into the public light, and that's why there was such a big rush after the George Floyd riots to corporations across America started scrambling to hire racial minorities. And I read an article the other day, and the title was, or the title of this article was something along the lines of, um, you know, ev- every white male hire at this like major corporation has to be signed off by me. And then the article was going on to say like, oh, president and CEO of X, Y, and Z company has followed suit with many other major corporations in America. Basically mandating that any new white male hires that are going through the admissions process and are hired have to, the paperwork has to go to the CEO's desk and she has to stamp it off like on a case by case basis. Um, and how they did have like a lot of quotas for because that's part of you can't have diversity, equity, and inclusion without uh, without changing the demographic makeup so that the goal is to achieve parity in the workplace, right? So if the workplace is too homogenous, if there are, let's say, at this car dealership, there are too many Caucasians, it's mostly Caucasians. Corporations were looking at that and they were saying, okay, there's no diversity here. So it's important that, over the coming years, and this is what corporations did, and starting in 2020, they said it's important that over the coming years that, I want to see, maybe the regional manager says, okay, I'm going to check back in 2 years. I want to see, you're at 95% Caucasian employees. Let's check back in 2 years. And, I'd like to see whatever, at least like 50 or 51%, African American, Hispanic, Arabic, or whatever it is. And I think that was because you can't have parity, you can't have racial parity if the workplace continues to be homogenous racially from a racial standpoint. And so I think that's what DEI was about, and that was the intention, was to achieve more equal racial representation.
Connor, I don't mean to cut you off, but just kind of for the sake of time, and Alexis, please butt in to offer more thoughts here. I think that what this is highlighting is that both of you have just very different conceptions or definitions of DEI. Connor, you can't really think of DEI without this affirmative action. Let's put in quotas. Let's make sure that the workplace has this percentage or at least this percentage of this demographic, etc. But Alexis, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is, the definition of DEI that you have in mind, and I'd imagine the public is split all over the place on what they conceive of DEI as well, is, whatever percentage of whatever group we have, once we have those people in, we need to make sure that people feel comfortable and respected. We need to ensure that, say, people are trained so they don't have like they don't unintentionally offer like these really rude jokes and insensitive jokes, etc. We maintain a professional and respectful workplace. We make sure there's accommodations for disabilities that might be needed, etc. And that might look place depending on differently depending on the demographics and workplace. But that's kind of what you're imagining. And So you just kind of have these completely different views of what we're even talking about. I mean, is that correct, Alexis?
Yeah, and that goes back to my initial point of like the definition is really important when you're looking at arguing these topics because I think that Connor and I have like innately different understandings of what it is, and just defining it can make it a lot more clear because I think again he's associating DEI specifically with I guess ethnic groups, but for me that encompasses women and again disability rights and the ethnic different groups. So
Yeah, and
I
it's
see what
it's
he's saying in terms of his perspective, but again, I have a broader understanding of it.
The LGBT, yeah, you're right. I forgot to say, DEI definitely includes sexual minorities as well, not just racial minorities. I'd like to acknowledge that. I forgot to state that. Yeah, so women and transgender, non-binary, etc. That's correct.
Okay, well, I think that we can keep talking about these topics for hours, but obviously we don't want the podcast itself to go on too long. Maybe we'll be able to follow up pretty soon with another discussion with each of you. But again, I just want to say thank you all for coming and sharing your perspectives, your thoughts, digging into one another's views, and we're just here to do our best to try to have a productive conversation because if we just exist in our own little bubbles and continue to only entertain our partisan viewpoints, we're only really harming ourselves and we're not really going to get anywhere productive as a country. So in any case, are there any like final or closing thoughts? I want to make sure that I'm not cutting anyone off who hasn't had a chance to speak much or whatever else. Just anything anyone wants to leave us off with.
It's been a pleasure talking with you guys. I know like some of these are contentious topics, but that's what we're here to really just gain a better understanding of what's going on in each other's heads.
And I want to say thank you, Connor, for being the conservative perspective because I know that you're kind of outnumbered. So thank you for taking the questions graciously.
Yep.
Yeah, same here. I think it was a really honest conversation, and I appreciate you for responding to every single one of our questions and rebuttals and all of it.
Yep. Yep. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you for a future episode probably. But otherwise, that's where we're going to end things today. So have a great day, everyone.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.